Second clap. So I made a short film. This is different. As of recording this, it's been about a week or two since I totally finished a short film I shot back at the end of July, which put an end to many, many months of procrastination and trial and error, and now I have this short film to show. But I'm presenting this video instead. The Sliding Worlds is my second proper attempt at a short film, and I say proper as in a script was written in screenplay format, shot lists were prepared, etc. I'll only be referencing my first attempt when necessary. You never cared about the family. You're always so ungrateful for everything they did. So, with this being attempt number 2, lots of hours were put in, and many, many mistakes and oversights were made in pretty much every step of the process. This video will be me breaking down the process, experience, and mistakes I made while working on this thing, both as a way of logging what I've learned for easy reference for myself, but also maybe this could be of interest or help to any other aspiring filmmakers who's just starting out. I am not an expert or properly experienced. This is just what I've taken away from this project here, and my biggest project so far, I guess. So I'll be going through everything from the initial idea all the way to calling it done. Last two things before we start, you don't need to have seen the short to understand this video, but for any of those who are interested, it's linked in full in the description for when or if you're interested. And also, I'm very... That's bad. As long as that doesn't happen again, I'll be fine. The light fell. Which is honestly probably thematically appropriate for what this video will be. What I meant to say was, I'm very aware that Patrick Willems did a video pretty much identical to this, well, relatively speaking, about his experiences when making his feature-length project. I've had this video planned since October, so this is in no way a ripoff, or at least not intended to be, but I highly recommend his video as well. And with that, let's get into Your Mom! The idea for the short started at around late December 2020 to mid-January 2021. I was talking to my brother, who plays Ben, the main character in the short, about what type of short film we could make. So the topic of doing an anthology-style short came up, and my mind instantly went to 22 short films about Springfield. But then, it went to multiverse. This might surprise you, but I'm a big fan of comic books, so I've always enjoyed stories about the multiverse, and I like the freedom it could provide in being able to mash together multiple segments without a consistent tone or style or story. And more so than that, I liked it because it's a good excuse to use the same location and the same short under different context, in this case being, well, my room. So this idea was now in my head, and then, and even, well, still now, when I go to make a short film, the main point of it is to build it as a way to practice an element of filmmaking. I intend to make proper features one day, believe it or not, and the best way to prepare for that and learn is to do, well, no-risk short films. So as I did with my previous short film, as great as that one was, I'm sure I'll talk about it someday, I thought about what I wanted to learn as a filmmaker and how to build a story to give me the space to learn that thing. And that goes for writing too. I decided the main thing I wanted to work on was basic shot, reverse shot, characters sitting and talking, dialogue scenes. Now that sounds basic and uninteresting, but it's something I really hadn't done before this, and I knew I should at least give it a try at one point. Of course, the short evolved to be more complicated than that, but this is where it started. I wanted to practice basic dialogue scenes. That's it. And with those intentions, ideas started coming. The writing started with me writing vague idea fragments into this notebook. In this stage, I decided the short would be in 3 segments and about worlds in the multiverse spilling into and colliding with each other. Objects would fall from one segment and into the other. And shortly after that, I moved to, hold your gasps, moving this sideways. And then I just filled out each segment and they were all on one page, and it was messy, but it got the job done. Then I graduated to sticky notes. They were color-coded and laid out in columns. Orange represented the overall vibe and tone of the segment, yellow the state and purpose of the characters, blue the possible events of the scene, and green represented what objects would move from one segment to the other. I was not committed to what was written on these, they just provided an easy way to keep track of the story, and I kept them laid out on my desk in rows until I started writing the screenplay. I wrote the screenplay in Fade-In. I don't know if there's a better program you're supposed to use, but the free version of Fade-In is basically perfect for me right now, and I like it a lot. Since I had no dialogue planned, the personality of the characters basically came together here, and oh boy, writing dialogue can feel like pulling teeth. Violently. But is it funnier with the violently? Well, sometimes. Much like with editing, I procrastinate a lot when writing. I usually just chip away at it a little bit over time. I mean, I'm better now than I was when I was making this, but yeah, it took a while. Because I am so easily distracted and can be very picky with what I actually put on the page, I always kept a little extra piece of paper next to me when I was writing. I would write down either little bits that I wanted to work into the story or just random stuff to fill out my mind until something actually came to mind for writing. And once I got fully into writing the screenplay, I basically just disregarded all my notes and outlines entirely and made the story based on memory of how it went. I just threw in whatever seemed like it would be a better idea, and this led to changes in characterization, little details, and the ending being totally changed. So the first segment was written to fulfill my initial want to practice dialogue scenes. I made it about a game of checkers to give the dialogue a concrete activity to flow around. The second segment turned into a way to practice moving dialogue monologue type scenes as Ben walks around the room explaining the multiverse. No spoilers, but this was directly inspired by a scene in Twin Peaks where Ben Horne does this really dramatic monologue thing, and I really liked the way it was acted and filmed, and that's why the main character is named Ben. On that note, the third segment seems the most overtly inspired by David Lynch, particularly Eraserhead, and while believe it or not, I am actually a big fan of David Lynch, and I want to elaborate on that here, but I had the third segment pretty much entirely outlined before even digging into his filmography. I had seen Mulholland Drive, but that had pretty much no conscious influence. Great movie, though. But as I was writing the screenplay, that was when I was digging into his filmography, and while it didn't affect the story, it did kind of give me a guide on how to execute what I was writing. The third segment was really just me wanting to practice doing purely visual storytelling, no dialogue, but I'm very much aware it comes off as an Eraserhead knockoff. And so in May, I finished the screenplay and printed it out. It clocked in at just over 10 pages long. This being a small short film, of course, there wasn't much to the pre-production process. It was just a matter of deciding when we were going to shoot it and how we were going to shoot it. The easiest decision was that we would do one segment per day over 3 days in chronological order. And then it was just a matter of figuring out how we would shoot the scenes. The first part of this is basically me just sitting there pondering what would be cool. I had most of the shots and rhythm in mind when I was writing it, but now I just needed to lay it out practically for an easy, headache-free shoot. Before preparing the shot list itself, I drew this on an index card. It's my desk, and those are cameras. Yeah, I'm not an artist and particularly great at spatial reasoning. I had no idea what this desk would look like in the middle of the room and how much room I would have to work with or what it would look like once we were sitting there and on camera. So that was just me trying to figure out a way of how the angles would be. The shot list was made by sitting there with a Google Doc file and the script and going through each moment, writing down a shot and then numbering it, and then writing the number in the script next to where it would appear. So A was Ben, B was me, C was wides, and D was inserts. So that would be A1, A2, B1, B2, etc. They'd be shot wides first, then Ben, then me, then inserts. Everything was going to be done in order, so we would start with Ben and then do all the lines that are listed with A1 and then all the lines and actions for A2, and it would go on like that. I don't remember how long it took me to prepare these, but I do remember it was a while. I honestly couldn't tell you if this is a good way of doing it or not. I'm sure there's a better alternative. On the last short I made, I did it by just writing down the shots on index cards, which were nearly incomprehensible when we were shooting, so this is still a step up. But I'll probably rework the system again when I go to do my next short. A couple months of spinning my wheels go by and it's time to shoot. I'll be going over how these segments actually turned out later. This will just be me going over what happened on the day when shooting them. Mostly. To quickly go over the gear used, it was shot on my brother's Nikon D5600 camera. We used this Rode mic and these LED lights and this light reflector thing. Also a tripod. Setting up the first segment was super simple, just move the desk into the middle of the room, grab a lamp from another room, and because the first segment's meant to have this kind of lazy, apathetic vibe, we didn't really have to worry about getting dressed or fixing hair or anything, so we were ready pretty fast and it was time to set up the camera. So, 24 FPS, 150 of shutter speed, f5.6, typical camera settings. It was at this point that I had the brilliant idea of, hey, if the lower the ISO, the sharper the image, let's shoot at a low ISO. It'll look crisp and professional. We have enough light. We didn't have enough light. So I decided to start with like 200 ISO or something. And this led to the very first noticeable problem when reviewing the footage later. The underexposure of the image caused it to have this really ugly, muddy green color to it, and the underexposure also makes color correcting a lot more difficult, and well, let's not get ahead of ourselves here. As the day went on and we lost light from the windows, I did gradually raise the ISO, which helped a little bit, but the damage was done. Does the image look blurry? Yeah. Immediate problem number 2, a ridiculous amount of the shots are just out of focus. Let me explain. So obviously we shot on manual focus, right? So the LCD screen where you see your image is not all that great on its own, which, makes it hard to tell. Add to that, where the microphone plugs into the camera is where the screen opens up, so you need to have it kind of like awkwardly closed and pointed up for it to not knock the microphone out, which made it even harder to tell. But wait, there's more. Order now and I'll tell you how I decided I didn't need my glasses to tell if the shots were in focus. I've seen Taxi Driver, I know when a shot's in or out of focus. Bah! So yeah, underexposed image and out of focus shots, I was on a roll, baby. Despite the explanation for why there are shots out of focus, really it just boils down to simple inattention and rushing. I've realized that while you're shooting, it's very easy for your eyes to get locked on that finish line, and that leads to overlooking stuff that seems incredibly obvious in retrospect. About midway through, I started looking through the little viewfinder thing where you look through for still pictures, and it was much easier to tell the focus with that, and that's the only reason there's any shots in this thing that aren't out of focus. But those issues weren't obvious until editing. Obviously, on the day, there were lots of little hiccups here and there. First up, the shot list. So, the directions I gave myself were clear. However, because multiple lines and moments throughout different parts of the script used the same camera setup, that quickly led to confusion on what had and hadn't been shot already. And since I wrote the numbers in the script in this dull gray pencil that got smeared, it became very easy to miss an instance of A1 or B3 or whatever. I guess the best way to avoid this in the future would be to use colored ink or something, or maybe do a more detailed spreadsheet type shot list, I don't know. Or even better, on the day I could have just watched back takes that we had done, but I didn't, because when you're shooting something, every little bit of time consumption feels like the biggest thing in the world. Let's talk about batteries. The camera was on that dreaded last red bar of battery for about half the shoot. Oh god, gotta get those shots done before the camera dies. A light died at one point. That's 20 or 30 minutes, you gotta let it charge. And while it's charging, you could have checked back the old takes, but you didn't, because that would take time. Now, I intend to be a director for a living at some point, right? Well, when you're starting out, you realize, oh shit, I'm not very good at this. More specifically, I vastly underestimated what it takes to convey what you want from a line reading to an actor. We're using the term actor loosely here. I can't tell if the microphone keeps covering my face or not. So, going into the shoot, I didn't give much thought in how I was going to convey to my brother how lines needed to be read. I just assumed we'd be on the same page. Neither of us are actors, if you couldn't have guessed that already.
Like, how could you even stop that? You're basically done for at that point. True.
But the acting could have been just a tiny bit better if I had been more clear in how things needed to be read. Because when I wasn't getting the reading that I wanted, that led to just me sounding out how I wanted, which, believe it or not, is about the most ineffective and annoying way to direct an actor. Again, we're using the term actor loosely here. And ironically, that caused more lost time than checking back shots would have, so funny how that works out. The shots where I was acting went by pretty fast. I just read how they were in my head, and my brother would give me input on if it was good reading or not. Your mom, 6 years ago. No, hold on.
It sounded like Alex Trebek on Jeopardy.
After my lines were done, we did the inserts, and then that was it. It took like 4-ish hours, which probably seems like too long, but to be fair, most of that was just us trying not to laugh when doing a take.
What was wrong with my delivery?
It just sounded funny.
Okay, I'm a funny guy.
Phony, no.
That's much worse.
I'll be more brief with the second and third days for the sake of time. Setup was super simple once again, and I shot at a more reasonable ISO. And the second segment is just generally more energetic and hammy than the first one, so it was more fun to shoot. It begins with Ben listening to a voice message from my character, and that was recorded in November.
Hey, Ben, what's going on?
I'd never done voiceover like this before, and I was very worried I would have issues syncing it up while editing, but I vastly overthought it. It's just a matter of getting a little extra footage, and from there's pretty much zero issues when syncing it up. Remember me saying I had trouble reasoning the space of the desk for the first segment? Well, on this segment, I did not properly account for my brother's height in relation to the desk at all. For some reason in my head, the desk was much taller, and that threw off my plans for a little bit. That seems irrelevant, but that is something I never would have thought would have been an issue when trying to shoot something in my own room. And on that note, I started the day following the shot list precisely, but then I decided, shot list, who needs them? The paper was already crumbled when I recorded that. I've done like 3 takes of that, and I'm not doing it again. Because there's so much movement in this segment, constantly referring to a list was just a drag. I just decided to play it loose and go off of Basic Instinct and whatever looked cool. Not the movie Basic Instinct, that's very important to note. And that led to lots of wobbly handheld shots and Sam Raimi-y type shots that I thought looked cool in the moment. And every single moment from finishing that day's shoot to actually editing it was absolute dread because I was convinced that it would be an incomprehensible mess. Also, the light bulb to that lamp died. Go. Now stop. You went too quickly.
Are you kidding me, Damien?
The bulb went out.
Yeah, it did.
Considering we don't have replacement bulbs, we'll just roll with it. The third and final day had the most complicated setup as I had to completely trash my room because the third segment was supposed to be a world that's been completely destroyed by multiverse leaks. It took about 45 minutes to set up, and right before shooting I decided to cut a chunk of the script for this. What was going to happen is there would be a bucket of water that was floating with junk and stuff and would be sitting in the same spot where my character was sitting in the first segment. The third segment version of Ben would go over to the bucket and look at the ceiling and see that a leak had been repaired, and he'd write down that in a notebook and the text would flash on screen. So it was like a joke that the water the character was drinking in the first segment was the leak water, and it was supposed to go on for much longer, the drinking, and it just would have added like an extra hour to the setup because there was no room in my room once I had moved my bed into the middle of the floor. So it just wasn't worth it for a kind of overly elaborate, obscure bit. So that got cut, and I usually forget that it was even there, so that means it was a good idea to cut it. Shooting was very fast and easy. I also barely referred to the shot list on this one because pretty much all the shots were in my head already and it wasn't that complicated. Admittedly though, we were a little fed up when we were filming this, and that just led to rushing through it, and that became incredibly apparent when I was trying to cut it all together. But I got the shots I wanted, and I think it turned out okay, so... And just like that, the shoot was over and it was time for the long, long slog of editing. So, I have a tough time with editing, and not as in I'm completely bad or clueless at it. It just feels like, you know those dreams where you're trying to run from something, but it's like you're going through mud and both your legs are asleep? That. Also, the camera died and it's a different day now. Anyways, it had to be done, and I edited the short on Adobe Premiere Pro using my brother's account. Lightworks is the editor I used to use, and that's free. I like Premiere Pro a lot, but I could have easily done this in Lightworks. So if you're worried about having to pay for an editor, you can do a lot with the free programs. I just used Premiere Pro this time because it's cooler. It took me a month to edit the short I did before this one, so this time I tried a new strategy where I took all the clips and just threw them into the timeline as fast as possible in what is effectively an assembly cut. And from there, I would just whittle it down a bit at a time, and to make it even more simpler, I was only doing one segment at a time. I've taped the cable to the microphone here because it keeps falling out and ruining every recording I do. Anyways, cutting together dialogue can be deceptively tricky when you're new to it. And add on to that a handful of factors like we didn't get enough reaction shots or characters turning their head, or we would often break character as soon as a take was done, and all that really restricts your options when you're editing it all together. When I started editing this thing, I was so off-put by the muddy image that I wanted to reshoot the whole segment, But my brother was really not into that idea, and honestly, it was for the best because I had to make the best of what I had, and it made the lessons a lot more clear, so it works out. And honestly, it turned out a little smoother than I thought it would. I wish I could show you how awkward and off-putting the original cuts of this were. Well, I mean, more so than it is in its completed state. Cutting together a dialogue scene where both parts were filmed separately and making it feel natural seemed like something that would be really challenging to me. But literally always when there's something that seems challenging, it's always just a matter of putting it in front of you and just working with what you have. And it'll usually come together more cleanly than you expect it to. There's a bit where Ben looks over at glasses that came in from the multiverse.
3, 2, 1. Perfect.
The take started with him already looking at the glasses, which makes no sense because he wasn't looking over there in the last shot. And we didn't have a shot of him turning his head that way, so the obvious solution was to reverse the shot because at the end of it he looks back in the direction of my character.
I didn't know you got glasses.
It kinda works. But it gets better. The dialogue for the next shot was wrong. My character says, I didn't know you got glasses. Ben looks over at the glasses. He's supposed to say, I didn't, I saw those in here earlier. But on the take, my brother said, they aren't.
They aren't. I saw those in here earlier. And
Makes no sense, completely killed the pace of the scene. But upon watching the failed takes back, on the first take, he got the line wrong. I corrected him. On the second take, he got it right, but I stopped him before he finished to correct his reading.
I didn't. I saw those in here earlier. I thought they were my dad's, but by the time I remembered to ask them, they were gone.
Alright. They aren't.
He got it wrong again. And the third take was the only complete take. And yes, that is entirely my fault for not, paying attention because I was only focused on getting the shot and moving on. So when editing, it just made the most sense to cut to mid-sentence instead of having him say they aren't when it's not replying to anything that was said.
I saw those in here earlier and I thought they were my dad's, but by the time I remembered to ask him, they were gone.
Yeah, stuff like that happens when you're not really paying attention when filming. This next bit is just more about how continuity can get lost in the edit, so the segment revolves around a game of checkers, and in the script, I took careful care to make sure the turns were in order. So my character takes a turn, Ben takes a turn, etc. But for the sake of flow, a couple of my character's turns ended up getting cut out, so it looks like Ben takes multiple turns in a row. It doesn't make sense, but it was about choosing flow of the edit or continuity, and I chose flow of the edit, which I think is always the right choice, but it's kind of funny when you realize it. Continuity in general just kind of fell apart because I would have to pull from completely unrelated takes to fill out a moment, and that led to props just kind of appearing and disappearing on the table. Some of this was also caused by the fact that we used the same camera setup for multiple bits, and that would lead to us not thinking about a prop needing to be moved. Let's just say it's multiverse, it fits within canon. One of the most jarring examples of us not getting footage of something is when a checker piece is knocked off into the floor. We both go down under the table to look for it, and my character sits back up in his chair, and Ben is supposed to do the same. But what happened was, we didn't get a shot of him sitting back up the chair. So what happened was, I just took a part of that was filmed of my brother listening to my direction, and I just kind of put that in there. And it's so obvious it's unrelated. It's like when movies put in footage from other scenes to fill out another scene because the actor died before he finished filming. It just sticks out, but it's kind of funny. The segment ends with me laughing at the tone of Ben's voice.
Anyways, even if this was all real, it's not like it affects us.
Don't say it with a deep voice like that. Why'd you slip into this really fake sounding deep voice?
Shut up. Alright.
Normal voice.
3, 2, 1.
That wasn't in the script, that was just me correcting and making fun of how my brother read the line, but we just kept it in because it fit the lazy vibe of the short and it relieved all tension before going into the second segment. Anyways, the point I'm trying to make with all these stories is that you can band-aid a lot of what goes wrong when filming in the edit, and putting so much time into correcting those mistakes will make it more clear, because it's very obvious these band-aids are noticeable and they're not as good as just getting it right on the day, but again, it makes the issues more clear and easier to avoid the next time around. I started work on the second segment feeling absolutely sure it would be completely incomprehensible and messy. But before I get into that, the voiceover bit went over really smoothly. I recorded the dialogue in Audacity and then added a phone call effect in Premiere Pro. And that was the extent of that. For each shot of Ben listening, we just did 1 minute long takes, and it gives you plenty of room to work with, and it's really that simple. Now it was time to edit the bits that were shot handheld. And to my surprise, they turned out okay. When you're expecting complete nonsense, it's very relieving when it's not that. Some shots are definitely a little awkward and messy, but most of them gave room to cut on motion, which makes editing it a little more smooth and easier. All it took was shaving off individual frames 1 or 2 at a time until it got to a point where it felt smooth enough. To reiterate this point again, do not overthink how the post-production process is going to go, because every single time I've worried about it, it's just been a matter of putting it in front of me and working it out. I know I said that earlier, but it is really that simple. It just takes a little time. But of course, nothing can ever be perfect or simple. So remember that Rode mic I mentioned earlier? Well, it turns out it wobbles a lot.
It's a twisted and deranged rabbit hole.
It's held onto the camera with this really crummy plastic mount, and I just did not consider the fact that it's a crummy plastic mount and would wobble every time you move the camera just a little bit. But, you gotta take the bitter with the sweet, and at least it wasn't completely incomprehensible. There's a moment in the segment where Ben finds a checker piece that fell in from the first segment, and he picks it up and he dramatically looks at it. When I cut it together, it felt like it went by way too fast than I wanted it to. But then I thought of the scene in Arrested Development where Tobias looks into a mirror and it does this really dramatic, cheesy 80s slow-mo thing. So I applied it to this clip.
This is exactly what I'm talking about.
And even though it looks incredibly cheesy, I like it a lot. In fact, for all 3 segments, I would often slow down or speed up clips to get closer to the pace that I wanted. On the other examples, you're not supposed to notice, but I'm sure you could find them if you paid attention. Again, a Band-Aid is never better than getting it right on the day. I don't know if it comes across as undisciplined or indulgent, but I think going with whatever random whims of inspiration you have, even as late as the editing process, just makes everything a lot more fun and less like a chore. Like, I cut out all sound from some insert shots because I like the effect it had in some Godard movies I watched recently. Was there a deep reason for these changes? No, but they're cool and I like it, so why not? The third segment came together the fastest, but it had its own challenges. Because we rushed the shoot and didn't pay enough attention to continuity and broke character as soon as a take was done, it became incredibly difficult to make it all come together as one stream of shots. An example of this is when Ben picks up a shirt that has been drenched in coffee that came from the second segment. In the wider version of the shot, my brother used his left hand to pick up the shirt, but when it cuts to a close-up, he's using his right hand. And when that happens, you just gotta go with the flow and make it as unnoticeable as possible. There's this one shot I like where he's standing in front of the window, which was not meant to be there, because if the sound was still in there, you would hear me counting down to action.
3, 2, 1, go.
But when I was editing and before I'd cut that bit out, I just liked that it gave a little bit of breathing room and the shot looked nice, so I kept it. As long as you feel like you understand the foundation and purpose for what your story is, then any type of random improvisation adds to the experience of making it, and I think will almost always make it a better final product. Once the third segment was done, I had to do the audio effects. I mean, yeah, that's how it sounds. Funnily enough, the main inspiration for this sound was this song called Face, which has this really compressed sounding drums in it. And I thought it would be cool to have something like that, but just sounds more droning and has a bunch of extra stuff added on top of it. So all these sound effects were done by me banging on my desk, the sound of a space heater, the sound of a space heater being dragged across the floor, me whistling, a TV being turned on, and me rubbing my fingers across the static on the surface of that TV. piled them up in Audacity and messed with the pause stretch effect and reverb and tone and pitch and all of that, and then it turned into this. Boom, just like that, knock off Eraserhead. After that, I just did color. That was a matter of me just kind of moving around with the sliders and the curve things to just make it look less ugly. Most of this was honestly just turning up the whites and turning down the greens because all 3 segments had a pretty heavy green look initially. The first segment, of course, was the most challenging because of the underexposed image and the out-of-focus image. There wasn't much I could do with it, so I just went with like a kind of washed-out warm look. The second segment was just basic color correction, and for the third segment, I guess I went with this kind of bleached bypass look. I don't know if that is what that is, but that's what I'm calling it. And just like that, the short was completed. And yes, all of these tales of editing took place over the course of like 5 months. The bulk of all of that was done in November. I just resigned myself to doing 30 minutes a day pretty much every day instead of doing 2 or 3 hours a day and then going 2 or 3 days without touching it. But yes, it was done, and this is how the timeline looked before I combined all the segments. It was over. But things still go wrong. First up, I accidentally selected the wrong option when trying to export the video. Oops, accidentally created a 110GB file, which my computer wouldn't let me delete for some reason. Then I was trying to upload it to an unlisted YouTube video to show to a friend, but oh no, for some reason Premiere Pro replaced the sound effects of the voiceover with the sound effects of the third segment world. Because I guess like it got the metadata mixed up because it was on a card, or at least that's what I read when I was trying to figure out how to fix the issue. But since I didn't have a backup of it before that mistake happened, I just had to completely recut that whole bit of the short film. But then it got done for real. The Sliding Worlds is a big ol' amateur mess, and I'm very much aware that I'm not going to be impressing that many people with it. But it perfectly served the purpose it was created to serve. I learned what I wanted to learn from it, and I'm not going to say I'm going to be an expert on these things from here out. I'll know what to do with these things when I approach them again. Even with just a project at this size, I feel like I have a much better understanding of the fundamentals of filmmaking rather than just some abstract idea of what I think looks good in other movies. And even better than that, I'm excited to apply what I've learned from this experience onto something new and hopefully better. And I think that fact alone is more than worth all the time I put into this one thing, even though it didn't turn out as cleanly as I wanted it to. I'm sure if you've made it this far into this video, you have strong opinions on or interest in filmmaking or movies. And if you do, I highly recommend just taking what your appreciation is of cinema and applying it to a short film or a story or whatever and just have fun with it. I think we all get a little too wrapped up in talking about and criticizing movies on the internet when making something of your own is pretty much always going to be more interesting and exciting. And it'll always give you at least a little bit of a deeper appreciation for the medium as a whole. Again, even at the small amateur level. And I mean that in the most sincere, unpretentious way I can. I don't know if this video comes off as indulgent or if anyone's even interested, but I do know that the whole process of making movies is extremely daunting, and it's very easy to just put it off for this little reason or that little reason. And even if you do get around to actually shooting something, it can feel like probably the worst artistic creation that man has come up with. And frankly, I'm making this video because I don't feel like The Sliding Worlds is good enough of a short film to offer up on its own. But this is also me saying I am very much excited to make more, and I'll probably do another video in this style, and I hope you, the viewer, do too. No, it needs to be more and I hope you, yes, you, the viewer, do the same. Go ahead. Prove you're better than me.
Recording.